Welcome everyone to today's forum, Globalization of Hong Kong's Health and Beauty Retailer, A.S. Watson's Journey to Greatness. This event is brought to you by World Scientific Publishing. I am Matthew, your MC for today. With extensive experience in the business and academic sectors, our panel of experts will be sharing the business case study of A.S. Watson's globalization journey on its growth strategy and journey from good to great from different perspectives of corporate leadership, branding and marketing, and organizational development. There will also be a Q&A following the panel discussion with the audience later, so please feel free to type your questions in the chat at any time. So to start with, just a few housekeeping notes. Please keep your camera and microphones off while the forum is ongoing. As just previously mentioned, please post your questions in the chat at any time for our speakers to address later. Also, this webinar will be recorded and posted online following the end of the forum. Today, we are very pleased to have with us a panel of 5 speakers. Our main speaker is Mr. Ian Wade, former Group Managing Director of A.S. Watson, who was responsible for expanding Watson's from 16 stores to 7,700 stores worldwide. He continues to share his wisdom and experience with clients as a strategic investment advisor. Joining him is Associate Professor Andrew Chan from the City University of Hong Kong. He has over 20 years of tertiary education experience and active in research in organizational culture, knowledge management, strategic leadership, human resource, and power in organizations. The moderator for today's panel discussion is Mr. Patrick Choi, the author of the book that inspired today's webinar, Transformation from Colonial Chemist to Global Health and Beauty Retailer, A.S. Watson. A qualified pharmacist, Patrick pursued an extensive business career and was the chief executive of a Hong Kong-based global charity foundation for AIDS orphans and left behind children in mainland China, before becoming a full-time author and business columnist in 2019. Our next speaker is Mr. Jim Wetrich, CEO of the Wetrich Group of Companies, through which he has consulted with more than 100 companies over the last 20 years. He is also an adjunct professor of marketing at Texas Wesleyan University, as well as a coach for executives across many industries. And finally, we are pleased to have with us Mr. Gordon Farker, a registered pharmacist and former CEO of Mannings North Asia under the Dairy Farm Group. While he was there, he was in charge of the $4 billion health and beauty business in many countries in Asia. He is now an advisor and consultant to a number of companies. Now, without further ado, let me hand the time over to Mr. Ian Wade to kick off this session with his presentation. Ian, I believe you might be on mute.
Greetings from Hong Kong. After 25 years with A.S. Watson, I felt it was a great story of almost 200 years and worth recording. Patrick Choi has done a great job of researching and then writing the book. This slide shows some of the businesses I acquired during my time with A.S. Watson. This slide shows the main personalities who guided Watson's throughout the 19th century. These included Alexander Skirvin Watson from the mid-19th century, whose name continues to this day. John Humphreys was a major part of taking ASW into the 20th century. A famous avenue is still named after him in Hong Kong. The predecessor of ASW, the Canton Dispensary, was the first business to install soda fountains in China. Since 1880, the hottest selling product range at Watson's were opium cures containing morphine as leisure drugs. So our relationship with Jardine started early. On this slide, you can see a group of products typical of Watson's range in the 19th and early 20th century. The 1970s were a slow growth period for ASW. Mr. Li Ka-shing took control of the business in 1979 and ASW was rejuvenated. Slide 4 shows the 4 little dragons that led the growth race in Asia during the 1980s. By 2000, Gen X had become the star, followed by Gen Y, and finally Gen Z then took over in shaping the global market. By the end of the 19th century, ASW served over 100 retail chemists in Beijing, Peking as it was then called, and the rest of China. In 1950, Watson's withdrew from China. In 1984, we opened a joint venture supermarket in Shekau, which is in Shenzhen, and entered the Taiwan market in 1987. In 1988, opened in Macau, and in 1989, we re-entered the China market with Watson's. We also opened ice cream manufacturing plants in China in 1993 and 94. The growing incomes in the late 80s and early 90s encouraged me to open in Singapore in 1988, Malaysia in 1993, and Thailand in 1996, which was a joint venture with Central Department Stores, who have recently bought Selfridges in the UK. By 1997, ASW had grown to 704 stores. After the financial crisis throughout Asia in 1997, I decided to explore the health and beauty market in Europe. After 15 years with Watson's, it became clear to me that health and beauty was less competitive and more profitable than food retailing. With Mr. Li Ka-shing's support, my first focus was the UK. Watson's has been in the water business since 1875. A new bottled water plant opened in 1903. In 1950, Watson's began delivering carboys to offices and homes. After years of success, I decided to look at the European carboy market and found it was very small. To try and differentiate Watson's water from growing competition, rapidly growing competition, I sponsored the Macau Grand Prix for 20 years, sponsored Hong Kong tennis for 13 years, and strongly supported Hong Kong's youth in the field of athletics. My UK quest initially found Sabres, a chain of 125 stores based in Darlington in the northeast of England. Having introduced own label into the range, within 3 years, sales jumped from 52 to 252 million pounds. And MPBT was up 3.8 times. After Savers, Dick Van Hadel, the CEO of the Kruidvat Group, contacted me in that he wanted to dispose of the Kruidvat Group of companies. After many months of negotiation, the group was bought for 1.25 billion euros. Concerned at such a large acquisition, Mr. Lee asked Goldman for their valuation, which was several hundred million euros higher. The list of chains acquired included in the Benelux, Kruidvat, with a Dutch market share of 37%, and Trekpleister. In the UK, Superdrug had 700 stores and was number 2 to Boots. In Poland, Hungary, and Czech, there were 314 stores, and we had a 40% share of them through Rossmann, the number 2 health and beauty retailer in Germany. Also, we had a 40% share of his 786 stores. At the end of 2002, ASW delivered a combined 5.1 billion euros with 3,237 stores in Asia and Europe. This slide shows on the left the 3 large acquisitions in Europe, and on the right, early starts in Russia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, and Turkey. So, plenty going on. This slide illustrates the number of joint ventures we had to undertake to meet each country's trading rules. Joining large family businesses in each country has worked out quite well. ASW's ice cream businesses in Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and Shanghai were attracting the attention of Unilever and Nestle, both fighting for supremacy in the China market. I eventually sold to Unilever for $95 million US in 1999. This produced a profit of $80 million on my investment. After building the Powwow Carboy businesses throughout Europe, I sold them to Nestle Waters in January 2003 for 560 million euros at 4.7 times our 2002 turnover. This slide illustrates the growth achievement on the left, followed by the huge importance of the private label contribution to the Watsons' profitability. In the late 80s, I had 25 buyers who were putting together a range of own label products for China, primarily. Without it, the profit margins would not be enough to pay hugely escalating rents in the 90s. We became number 1 in China and have stayed that way to this day. On the right-hand side is a model of team measurement, operating a rapidly growing number of countries. Finding and growing capable management was stretching. Thankfully, it worked most of the time. Although business life was rather busy during my tenure, excuse me, supporting good causes was always a priority. Supporting the Red Cross since 1982, helping the Hong Kong Community Chest since 1983, sponsoring Hong Kong tennis for 13 years, and president of the Hong Kong Athletics Association were a few of my activities. This slide looks to the future and shows the part Asia will play in the retail category. The huge change to online retailing in Asia, particularly, has left some leading retailers rather flat-footed. This last slide shows my entry into Priceline, now Bookings. Goldman Sachs New York contacted me to see if I would be interested in taking a piece of Priceline, based in northeastern USA. Although a totally new category for me, I quite fancied the new challenge. Mr. Li Ka-shing again supported me, and we bought 31.8% of the shares for $2 per share. After changing the business model from air ticket discounting to hotel room savings, Priceline grew dramatically and became #1 in the world in internet travel. When I retired, the shares were sold for a profit of $300 million US. Today, they would be worth $12 billion US. In summary, success in business is about timing, quality management, and of course, a good product. In hindsight, I was lucky to arrive in Hong Kong in 1982 and have the support of Li Ka-shing. Without his vision and support, much of what we achieved in 25 years likely might not have been possible. I am most grateful to Patrick Choi for making the book a reality. Rarely does one get to record such a story of length and quality. I am pleased to have been a small part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'll now be handing you over to our moderator for today and author of the title, Patrick Choi, who will be leading the panel discussion with our other panel members. But I'd just like to quickly remind the audience to put your questions in the chat for the Q&A that will follow this discussion. So over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Ian, for your presentation of Watson's globalization strategy. I'm sure by now all of us have learned from you firsthand how successful that you have brought a near bankrupt company to its greatness as of today. So in the following discussion with the panel, I will put forward a few questions to each of you, focusing on certain areas. The first area I would like to talk about is geographical expansion strategy. So Ian, in your presentation, you have mentioned India as the next potential market like China, or perhaps the largest market by 2030. So what would you anticipate the challenges of entering India anytime, as this is the most promising market to be?
Yes, Patrick, it is promising, but it's also tricky, as many have found out. I was there in the early 2000s looking at retail in India, whilst I was helping Hutchison Telecom with their joint venture in India. I made many contacts, and many small companies were willing to join me. But in the end, Mr. Lee was not so keen on India, so I did not take the risk.
Right. So to you, Andrew, as an academic, you have observed from what Ian has presented, for companies to become successful in its geographical expansion, in your view, what are the main, characteristics for such companies to become successful?
Thank you, Patrick, for the question. There is no magic bullet or formula for success. However, there are some characteristics, as you said, or ingredients of success in moving abroad and in the context of expansion. And that it's companies which are rich in its resource. And in Ian's sort of talk, he mentioned about the competency and capability of internal managers. In other words, their business acumen, foresight, and so on. As well as, in terms of proven success of some of what the company has been doing so far. And finally, a good sense of cultural sensitivity to the potential destination or target market that the company will want to expand to be moving on. Thank you, Patrick.
Right. Gordon, with your global background in Europe, in Asia, in the US, if you were to enter the Indian market, so to speak, what do you think that, you would you become a first mover or you become a late mover,
I think for India, it's maybe a question of should you go in rather than when you go in. I would definitely be the type of person that would say be a late mover rather than an early one. Plus, there's a lot of early movement to be gained, and there's a huge amount of risks associated with it. I mean, it was only a few years ago we were talking about the BRICS being the future of business globally. Brazil's gone quite badly. Russia speaks for itself, and China has. Anybody entering China has found quite significant difficulties there, with Watson's being the exception to that. India is a hugely fragmented market as well. It doesn't have the same infrastructure that a lot of other countries have. And also there are many different types of aspects of culture there that will influence local purchasing. All of these makes it, in my opinion, a very difficult market to go into. And, I think if someone was going to go in, I think you need to have a very local partner with significant influence in the region, and stick to one region and just work at that start off with.
Right. Jim is a very good friend and former colleague of mine, and he's also a bestseller in the USA Today and also Wall Street Journal. So Jim, with your previous experience in Europe and of course the US, what will be your considerations in geographical expansion? Will you look at markets in terms of market share, revenue growth, or first mover? So what will you do? Yeah. Whether it's India or China or any other large, potential market.
Yeah, Patrick, thank you, and congratulations on your book. And Ian, thank you for sharing your experience with us. It's such an absolutely fabulous story. In terms of diversification, in terms of expansion, Patrick, I think first of diversification, diversifying your business, getting beyond your current, geographic boundaries. Clearly, it's any business, cash is king, and it's all about profitability. You've got to be able to maintain your profitability, grow your profitability, however it is you measure that. I like return on invested capital. What are we doing with the money that we're investing? You can see time and time again in Ian's story how they were able to maximize their return on their invested capital and do extremely well. And I think the last thing, and to your question, Patrick, is first mover. And there's data that show that being the first mover isn't always the best position. So, and I think Gordon made some beautiful points about India. And there's a lot to learn. And one of the things I think truly important in business is learning from failures. And there's a lot of companies that have tried to get into a lot of markets. And I think looking at why they've failed is as helpful as almost anything.
Right, very good. So another topic on leadership. Ian, in your presentation, you talk about common characteristics of a great team player. Please explain, how do you motivate your young talents to achieve new heights?
Well, a lot of our young talent was promoted to a senior level at a very early stage, because clearly with the amount of growth we had, we were looking for bright young things to take on the business, and we found many, and I was privileged to develop them and take them to new levels in Europe and Asia, and of course, apart from developing their careers, I always made a point of paying them well. Right,
very good. So this question to Andrew. Some companies, including Watson's now, is practicing reverse mentorship, where leaders are being coached by junior managers to become better leaders. So this seems to be a revolutionary idea by turning the hierarchy of the 5 levels of leadership upside down. So in your view, how do you see that?
Thank you, Patrick. By reverse mentoring, the management literature seems to suggest that it was started in the mid-90s in General Electric under the reign of Jack Welch, who sort of asked the junior to become the mentor or the reverse mentor or coach to their senior staff in terms of chronological age. Now, this is in a, for example, in a Hong Kong or Chinese context, definitely sort of turned the leadership hierarchy upside down. So for companies to want to try this, there are perhaps a number of things that they need to watch out. In other words, whether those senior managers have an open mind and they are prepared, or whether or not they are prepared to let go of their ego or be humble and show a lot of humility in sort of giving the chance to the young stars in the corporate ladder to coach them, give advice, or just to be on the sideline cheering up.
Right. Very good.
That's how I see it. Thank you.
Cool. So Jim, as a bestseller author of Stifle, Where Good Leaders Go Wrong, and a certified executive coach, that you have met many level 5 leaders, CEOs. So what is your view on reverse mentorship? Would it work in every industry and every function, in your experience?
Yeah, good question, Patrick. Thank you. I mean, I think there's things to be had from the process per se. I think some of the benefits weigh a little bit more heavily on companies that perhaps might be business to consumer versus business to business. That said, what I hear and what I see from companies doing it today is it's a technique they're using to increase the retention of millennials, right? So millennials love to feel part of the organization and that they're contributing something. So that's a way to do it. Companies are also using the young talent to keep up with technological advances. And clearly for so many companies now, being on the digital cutting edge is absolutely critical. And a lot of these younger consumers, younger workers are much more digitally savvy than people perhaps, of my generation or similar generations. And lastly, I think, you know, Patrick, in many companies, you have a very broad and diverse employee base. You've got people that are now in the US, particularly working well into their 60s. And you've got people now that are, you know, 20s starting out, and companies are using reverse mentorship to build bridges between those very, very, very disparate generations.
Right. So Gordon, in your view, I mean, for North American market, European market, like the UK market, and Asia, that you're familiar with all this, reverse mentorship, in your view, where would it work best as of now?
Well,
in this different
I don't think it's. I think there are three elements involved. Right. There is certainly the country culture will have an impact on it. The industry culture will make it either easier or less easier to adopt it, and also the business culture itself. So those three things are taken into account. If you think there are some countries that are much more hierarchical in their nature, especially in Asia, there are a few countries where there is very much a hierarchical basis to the country and to the businesses and the people working within that country. That can make it quite difficult to have this going in, because you'll often see people more junior in the company only telling the boss, so to speak, what they think he or she wants to hear. That said, it's maybe in places like those where you will get the most benefit. I would say that the best leaders I ever came across were those who always went in retail to the shop floor to speak to the assistants, to the most junior people, because they're the ones closest to the customer. And they're the ones who actually create value for the company because they have the transaction. And therefore, I think reverse mentorship is a great way of formalizing, which is something which is actually just really good leadership practice.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Okay. So all good. So the next area I would like to touch upon is globalization. So Ian used to travel, every week, Europe, Asia, China. So in your time with A.S. Watson's, was the U.S. market on your radar at all in terms of investment? And if not, why not?
Yes, I went many times and looked at CVS, Walgreens, and Rite Aid, who were number 3 then, and looked at the possibility of buying Rite Aid. But having studied with some depth their offer in USA, it's largely prescription dependent. And my offer is not. And therefore, I felt in the future of prescription business would become different. And my goodness, has it become different? And I'm somewhat glad that I didn't venture into health and beauty in America. I mean, it wouldn't be a disaster because they've gone into insurance and other businesses, the CVS's and the Walgreens, the big boys. They're finding their way, but it's not in prescription business, which has now moved online. So that's why I don't regret turning down. Priceline was a different story. Right.
Yeah, I'm sure that, when you look at opportunities, you would focus on, whatever can bring in the cash, or the potential. So Andrew, having said that, as a Hong Kong academic, you have seen many Hong Kong manufacturers have exported to the global markets, and yet few, if any, of the Hong Kong retail or service companies have gone global. What do you think the reasons behind this?
It's a challenging question, actually. I mean, Patrick, to be able to give an explanation in 1 minute. However, let me give an example of Coca-Cola, a global brand, although you're referring to Hong Kong manufacturers and service industry. But for a kind of global product like Coca-Cola, the international global market, if you look at it from as an atlas, it is a colorless atlas of the world. In other words, that product was so good, its feature, it could sort of move around anywhere and it will enjoy consumer receptivity. So put it back to the context of manufacturing versus, in your question, was the service companies. Okay, so manufacturers might have then therefore a singular or a suite of products or goods which are good enough and they are confident to draw people's attention in different sectors in different parts of the world, whereas it is more challenging to replicate DNA of service sector kind of as well as involved with a logistic challenges and so on. That's my best shot in 1 minute. Thank you, Patrick.
So in short, it sounds like, Ian is the only guy, that has really brought a retail business.
Almost, yes. It's hard to replicate the DNA of success again, unfortunately, for some of the audience.
So we must study Ian, in real depth then. Okay, Jim, many US technology companies have been successful when they go to Europe or Asia. And yet fewer European or Asian companies have been successful if they go to the US. So is the US a protective market, or is it so difficult to crack? So
yeah, Patrick, thank you. I think people mistake open with easy. There aren't a lot of barriers to entry for a lot of companies in our country in many industries. But they also see America as one, the United States, and we could spend the rest of this time talking about how ununited the United States are, right? We're 50 plus unique states, districts. You've got Puerto Rico, other of the outlying islands, and it's incredibly complex. And the other thing that is a challenge for non-US companies is geography, right? We're massive, right? It's a huge geographic footprint and time, right? If I'm based in Europe, if I'm based in Asia, where do I put my headquarters? There may be an 8-hour, 10-hour, 12-hour difference between the US operations and the non-US headquarters. And that can be extremely challenging. And I think there's generally just a lack of understanding about how complex the market is. And lastly, I think although it always varies, but a number of companies try to send a large entourage of people from the headquarters into the US to try to build a business there, but they just don't have the expertise in regard to many things that make a business in the US successful.
Right. So Gordon, you have been with Walgreens Boots Alliance. You have been with Asian health and beauty retailers. So how do you see for US globals or European global health and retail business, what will be the next markets that, in your view, they should go into,
Well, it's going to be interesting, Patrick, because I wonder if we're going to see a situation of deglobalization in retail. You're seeing a situation over the pandemic years where businesses have struggled tremendously to be able to operate across borders. Certainly, we have Zoom, we've got Teams, etc. However, it has become extremely difficult. And you've seen a situation where even in Walgreens Boots Alliance, Walgreens is trying to divest Alliance, they've divested Alliance Healthcare and they want to divest Boots and have been unable to do so. So I think there'll be an element of that. I think if you're looking at new markets, I think you should look at it in two ways. You can either look at the size of the market, which usually brings you to China, and then we've talked about India, or you look at those that are now most likely to grow rapidly. And for that, I think there are smaller markets relative to those, that have a huge amount of potential. And for that, I would look at Vietnam, certainly in Southeast Asia, Indonesia.
So on the next area, I would like to seek your inputs would be acquisitions, mergers, and divestments. Ian, in your long list of acquisitions, mergers, and divestments, what were your most satisfactory and most challenging ones?
Well, we had so many, but in overall terms, the one that turned out to be most difficult was Mariano, based in France, and as well as being in France, or in other European countries as well. But unfortunately, we didn't do sufficiently due diligence, and it turned out to be not quite what we thought it was going to be. It's doing okay, but it was my disappointment of the many things that we bought over about 8 years. Everything else has come to fruition and been good.
Right. So Andrew, in terms of acquisition, mergers, and divestments, cultural issues are normally things that companies have encountered, and I think a large number of acquisitions, they failed terribly. But in the case of A.S. Watson's, I mean, Savers, Superdrugs, and others that Ian at the time he acquired, they are remaining there, and they're going, become stronger and stronger. So in your view, what actually, in terms of acquisitions, mergers, it seems that whatever deals with Ian, everything got ironed out, either with force or by persuasion, or by hook or by crook, But what are these, issues, cultural issues that you have seen
It's
as
a very
an academic,
ambitious question.
not Ian has ever encountered? Yeah.
It's a very ambitious question there with 3 types of things: acquisition, divestment, and merger. But thank you for your lead. You mentioned acquisition. So my response is to take a chemist's metaphor. It's the chemistry that works. The way you describe it, what you said, because they are chemists, that it works. The chemistry will, and that's the sense. It's like the culture. It's the social glue that holds things together. It seems they got the mixture right, or they got this Harry Potter-like magic wand, which makes this mixing of different cultures. You say in different regions of their atlas of acquisition, it looks at different ethnic culture and business culture and so on. The ball is in Ian's court. You want to follow it up, but you're right. So there are oil and water kind of reaction.
I will follow it up if I may, because what I found, I think over 8 or 9 years, we looked at 26 companies with a view to purchasing them. And I, in every case, dealt with the seller myself. I never used a bank. A, because generally you pay more, and B, the relationship turned out to be important in the execution of the business, almost in every case. And that would be my moral of how to buy a company. Deal with the seller yourself. I bought some of them so cheaply because of a good relationship with the seller, to be honest.
Thank you. Jim, in your executive coaching sessions, how do leaders or CEOs cope with corporate changes in acquisition, mergers, and divestments? You have coached many CEOs, board members, what makes them, become successful or fail, in your view?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I think people now understand more than ever because of what's happening on a globalization basis. They need to be agile, right? And agility is very important, as is resilience, right? Things are changing, things are constantly changing. Look at what impact COVID had on companies and how they had to respond to survive, or some that just weren't able really to respond with their business model. I think more and more, the data is very compelling. More and more companies are bringing in coaching to work with people to help with retention during some of these integrations, right? It's, you know, when you're a senior executive, you can't always talk to your board and you can't always talk to your staff. So it's nice to have somebody you can talk to. What senior people are concerned about is, how do I navigate this new company? How do I navigate the new culture? You know, I had a great network. I knew most of the people in the previous company. I knew the senior leaders. I want to continue to grow. I want to continue to get advance. How do I build, you know, my network into the new organization?
Right. Okay. So Gordon, in your prior experience, what was your biggest challenge in acquisition, mergers, and divestments?
Really getting into the detail, especially in different cultures. In less developed countries, who may not have the same accounting principles or the attention to detail on certain legalities that you may have in a more developed country. It could be the same for things like CSR issues, that you don't want to find yourself tripping over sustainability issues, etc. And so being able to do your due diligence and being able to get really into the detail of what's happening in the business is absolutely fundamental.
Right, very good. So I think in view of time, you know, what I would like to do, first of all, thank you, gentlemen, you know, for your very fruitful answers. And I would pass it on to Matthew, because I'm sure that, you know, those participants in the webinar, they have many questions they want to ask. You know, maybe you'd like to put forward the earlier pop ones.
Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. So we've got a few questions in the chat that I'll read out, and then feel free to answer, or Patrick, maybe you can delegate to one of our panel members. So the first question, which I believe is probably aimed towards Ian, is how did you get some support from Li Ka-shing?
So Ian, before you answer that, I saw from the top, the guy who asked the question that I used to contact with, he's an assistant editor with the London Telegraph.
Oh, right. I think the confidence grew. Don't forget the original businesses of Li Ka-shing in the 70s and 80s were all created by Guilos, or white people. And KS had a very balanced view on Chinese or others. And because of the track record, I got his faith and support, and he was absolutely terrific. His ability to spot a deal in new circumstances was unbelievable. And he is the only Hong Kong Chinese who's ever really conquered the world. I mean, he's just a brilliant guy.
So the next question we have is, what are the similarities and differences of consumer behaviors in Hong Kong and the UK, or perhaps the US?
So you could write a book on one of those. Maybe that's for you next, Patrick. I mean, there are a number of things. Infrastructure has a large impact on it. And I'll give you a few examples of that. In the US, everybody shops by car virtually. Target, Walmart, etc. all have huge car parks outside, and they retail shopping in terms of bricks and mortar is all done by car. In Asia, and therefore it tends to be more of a weekly shop or a periodic shop. In Asia, it tends to be more frequent. People tend to travel by foot or underground or MTR to their shops, and the shops, you know, in places like in in a lot of the cities are very dense. They don't have shopping malls in the same way that they have in the United States. Europe tends to be a bit of a crossroads of the two, except that Europe tends to form out of high street shopping predominantly. And that unfortunately has been really, really hit by the ongoing development of e-commerce. And so it's quite interesting when you look at retailing from an e-commerce point of view. It's gone very well and very quickly in the United States, where it saves you having to travel to collect things. There's been lower uptake in it in Asia, apart from China. And the pandemic has really pushed it in places like Hong Kong, where actually e-commerce wasn't really a big issue until recently. And then in Europe, the pandemic has really pushed it, and actually to the detriment of bricks and mortar, with some high streets now. If you look at Oxford Street in London, it looks a sorry state of affairs. Lots of closed businesses and closed shops.
Excellent. So mention of the pandemic sort of leads us on to our next question, which is in view of the current economic turbulence and the uncertainty of COVID-19 pandemic, will the health and beauty sector emerge from the slow growth of the retail market soon?
Yeah. You want me to do that? Yes. I mean, looking at today's market, some of the operators have picked up the challenge of online retailing and changed their model to quite some degree and will prosper. Some of the more traditional businesses have not done that and will suffer the consequence. But I mean, the psychology of emerging from COVID, of course, it's now not being taken that seriously in many countries apart from China and Hong Kong. So yes, it depends on the fittest, and the fittest will do well, and the ones that haven't really acclimatized themselves to change are not going to.
Right.
Yeah. The next question we have is, other than health supplements and toiletries as the main products for retail, health and beauty business, what will be the third most promising category to grow?
Gordon?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, those two categories are going to grow tremendously. You know, following on to what Ian said, I think health and beauty has got a great future going forward. I think that the beauty in particular will rebound post-pandemic, especially the color cosmetics, which has been obviously impacted because people didn't want to wear cosmetics when they're wearing masks. As that declines, then you're going to get a rebound from an increase in sales in color cosmetics and beauty products. Health supplements will continue to develop. I think one of the interesting things within that and within health is as a result of pandemic, younger generations are now taking a greater interest in health than any other generation before. Because when we were all growing up, we thought we were invincible because we never had to live with something like this. Now, post-pandemic, people have now realized that this is something that affects you at any age stage of your life. And therefore, people are going to get more interested in health at a much younger age. So I would be looking at the health sectors predominantly, including supplements, but also medicines, preventatives, etc. Diagnostics will move quite quickly as well. So do-it-yourself diagnostics, etc.
Jim, I mean, it's interesting that, the US so-called health and beauty market is quite unique by itself because we have very large stores of CVS. They have a prescription counter with a pharmacist or so-called chemist in the UK dispensing medicines. And then you have, aisles and aisles of, that selling, health supplements, toiletries. In your observation or with your friends, what are the categories that U.S. hypermarket like drugstores they're selling? Would it be food or anything that you have observed?
I think they've played around with a lot of those things. But as I think Gordon was saying, it's still the bricks and mortar are important, right? The Costco's of the world, the Targets of the world, the Best Buys, and I'm talking really, I say of the world of the U.S., right? People like to get in their car and have that experience if they can. And a number of these organizations, including Walgreens, I know, particularly going far back as, the late 90s and early 2000s, thought that drive-through was going to be huge, that not only drive-through pharmaceuticals, but I'll go online, I'll put my order online, and on my way back from home, I'll stop and pick up, my $100 worth of stuff from Walgreens. And that just never really materialized. And now it's been replaced by e-commerce. Health related things continues to dominate the US GDP. We're now somewhere nearly 20%. And, wow. Plastic surgery, cosmetic surgery, dermatologists in the US, I think without exception, are all making over $1 million a year. It's just a huge, huge, huge business.
Great. So we've got two more questions. So the first is, I understand that Watson's private label portfolio has been highly profitable for many years. Will it ever become like Holland & Barrett or Sephora with 80% of its products as private label instead of its current level of around 40%?
I think it's either Watson's or Gordon, you can look into it. I mean, is there any possibility that for Watson to become something like a own brand, retail business?
I think it'll be interesting to see how this develops, because one of the problems that general retailers have now is that the big manufacturers want to go straight to consumer wherever possible. Right. And e-commerce gives them an opportunity to do that. And that means and by going straight to consumer, they don't have to share the profit with the retailer. And therefore you have this situation where I think, and you see it throughout the world, that department stores and people who have not control of the product, retailers who have not control of the product, are having this and challenge it. Therefore, I could see a situation that Watson's could move to having a higher percentage on own label, because that allows you to set your own prices and have differentiated products as well. The only thing is that all of these health and beauty chains, whether it's Manning's, whether it's Watson's, Guardian, Boots, Walgreens, have all been able to get the footfall based on having a combination of national brands and own brands. I think coming through as companies look for differentiation, reduce their dependency on manufacturers, and finding ways to become more profitable in very difficult trading circumstances and economies.
So what is the last question, Matthew?
So the last question that we have today is, what is next for Watson's? Sort of the next 5 years and looking beyond.
Anyone can answer that, Do you have a crystal ball? Because I'm going to buy some stocks, of C.K. Hutchinson after this webinar. Yeah.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, or not going to buy, depending on your answer, of course.
Well, I mean, I've been out of it for quite a long time, so I'm not really qualified to give an opinion of what Watson are going to do. But I mean, they've got a great foundation. I think store-wise, they're the biggest in the world now, that Walgreens and CVS have let some stores go. So I think if I were in Watson today, I'd be thinking strategically of which direction to go, because the name carries so much with it. And I don't think it's been used sufficiently well, if I may say.
Right. Very good. Very good. So gentlemen, and also the participants in today's webinar, thank you very much for everything. So I'll pass it on to Matthew. Thank you.
So thank you to all of our speakers for the informative discussion and for taking part in the webinar today. And thank you again to all of you in the audience for joining us today as well. I trust that today's session has given you much food for thought and perhaps even inspiration and guidance about how to take your next business steps. We would like to invite those of you who are in the audience from Hong Kong to come to the book launch event tomorrow at the Bookazine flagship store in Central. If tonight's webinar has intrigued you, please do check out the book that has inspired this webinar on the business case of A.S. Watson. More details can be found on screen and in the chat. Have a lovely evening, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.